Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the third academic event of the Cheongju Craft Biennale 2021 International Colloquium on Craft. I am Chairperson Bang Nam-hee of the Executive Committee, and I will serve as your today's Master of Ceremony. Glad to meet you all. This International Colloquium on Craft is the third academic event of the Cheongju Craft Biennale 2021. In this event, we would like to take a deep look into the topic of the Biennale, which is tools for conviviality, and have presentations and discussions so that we can create synergy between exhibitions and academic scenes and contribute to the formation of new sorts of discourse on craft. This program is divided into 3 sessions. In each session, we will have a chance to listen to a speaker's presentations and also discussion where free exchange of ideas will take place. The themes of the session 1, 2, 3 is conviviality caring, craft value sharing, and craft cities regeneration respectively. We have a total number of 8 speakers from home and abroad. All the presentations and discussions are pre-recorded and will be made public in order starting from the 28th to 30th of September. The edited videos will be made available on the online exhibition site of the Cheongju Craft Biennale and also on the YouTube channel. In this presentation, we will delve into the topic of material intelligence. The material intelligence refers to the ability to appreciate the joy the materials give us, as well as the skills of manufacturers that are embodied by the material. I believe this concept of material intelligence is a great way for us to look at the value of crafting. But before we begin, let me explain how we will proceed. We will listen to the presentation of our speaker who are joining us on Zoom, which will be followed by a discussion session with a discussant who is present on site. The discussion session will help us approach today's topic in question from diverse perspectives. Then, without further ado, let me introduce today's speaker and discussant for the topic of the case for material intelligence. As our speaker, we have Glenn Adamson, former director of the Museum of Arts and Design. Mr. Glenn Adamson is a curator and a critic who works across the field of craft, design, and contemporary art. He served as a head of research at the Biennale Museum in the UK and also published multiple books and papers, some of which were translated and published here in Korea, including Thinking Through Craft and The Invention of Craft. Hello, Mr. Glenn.
Hello.
Next, we have our discussant for this session, President Kim Ji-hye from the Korean Association of Art and Design. President Kim is an associate professor for ceramic arts at College of Arts and Design, Ewha Women's University. She is currently leading the academic division of the Research Institute of Ceramics at the university and serving as the chief editor of the academic journals. As a ceramist herself, she is actively producing artworks and producing multiple papers and reviews on contemporary ceramists or challenges for modern ceramic arts. So we are joined by 2 distinguished figures to have a presentation on the case of material intelligence, and which will be followed by the discussion. First, Mr. Glenn Adamson will deliver his presentation under the topic of the case for material intelligence. I had a chance to take a look at his talk, look at his idea beforehand. AI is indeed a big thing, and the entire world is being connected through medium. So this concept of material intelligence and the value of material is reminded by his talk. So I come to think about the connection and the link between the climate change and the material intelligence, and I believe many audience will be looking forward to listening to your talk. So I very much look forward to your presentation. The floor is yours, Mr. Adamson.
Thank you very much, 안녕하세요. It's so nice to be with you today. A real honor to be included in this event. And I thank you all for your interest in my work. As was mentioned in the kind introduction, I've had the real pleasure of having a couple of my books translated into Korean, and I'm so happy that they are finding an audience there. I'm going to be speaking about a concept that I call material intelligence tonight. And I wanted to say that I have written an essay about this, which is simply called The Case for Material Intelligence, and that will be translated in the conference proceedings. What I'll be saying tonight is a little bit different from that because it's more visual, and I wanted also to focus more on the ideas of craft and on crafted objects. And I also thought that it would be nice to start with an example from Korea. So with that in mind, I'm going to go ahead and begin showing my slides. Nobody in the audience will need to be told what this object is. It is perhaps the most famous of all functional artworks from the Korean tradition. Of course, it is the moon jar. This became a popular form in the court of the Chosun dynasty, so 16th, 17th century AD. And as I think you all probably know, it is a ceramic form that is made from two bowls or two hemispheres that are joined together at the rim. And then, of course, a foot and a mouth is added. And the form is very well named, the moon jar, because of course it looks like a full moon in the sky. However, it's not perfectly round. I guess the real moon isn't perfectly round either. And what it gives you is this wonderful sense of the material qualities of fired clay, of ceramic, that milky white glaze over the clay, and also the very slight nuanced line of the silhouette. So when you look at a historic moon jar like this one, you almost want to hug it. It has this incredible presence, like another body with you, and it's irregular, like a human body is. It's often said that they have a lot of personality. Each moon jar is different, and I think they really bring you into contact with materiality in a way that is extremely profound and extremely unique. So we begin with this Korean example. I wanted to show a couple of examples also of other cultures that have been inspired by the moon jar. And here I should say that this group of objects that I'm about to show you was featured in an exhibition about British studio pottery that I did at the Yale Center for British Art a few years ago. There's a nice catalog for that project, which is called Things of Beauty Growing, British Studio Pottery. So if you're interested, you can also find that book. But we included some contemporary potters who were making their own versions of moon jars. So here, for example, we see an image of the Welsh potter Adam Buick, and these two examples are actually in his kiln. So this picture is showing you the pots when they're still hot, just when the kiln is opened. And as you can see, he's made one moon jar on the right that's quite similar to the historic precedent, although a little bit more symmetrical, a little bit more perfect. And then on the left, he's created a moon jar with an unconventional glaze, a blue glaze with a kind of splash of darker pigment, almost like an abstract expressionist painting. An even more radical and inventive version of the moon jar can be seen in the work of Akigo Hirai, who is Japanese, but also works in England. She is based in London. And I remember that when one of my colleagues at the museum saw this piece, she said to me, usually looking at a moon jar is like looking up at the night sky and seeing the moon. This piece is like actually landing on the moon and stepping on the rocks because it has such incredible texture and this wonderful sense of geology. So just as the original moon jar connects you to the ceramic, the qualities of ceramic in a very immediate way. This does the same, but almost goes further by suggesting that it is connecting you to the sources of ceramic deep in the crust of the earth. So you really feel here like you're digging or excavating into the secret source of the object itself. Although it's interesting to notice that this is achieved not through a straightforward set of materials, but actually using very unconventional materials. For example, paper fiber, which is not usually incorporated in ceramic, of course. So what we see in Hirai's work in particular is proof that to create a very expressive form, and I would argue this is true for any artwork, sculpture, painting, photography, printmaking, as well as ceramic or weaving or woodwork, the mediums that we associate with craft. But to make artwork in any of these disciplines, one has to have what I call material intelligence, which was very well described in the introduction. It simply means the ability to enjoy and understand and connect with materiality, and also the ability to manipulate materiality. And of course, the one leads directly to the other, because you cannot be an effective maker in a material unless you deeply understand that material first. And here, Akigo Hirai is demonstrating this at a very high level. The Moonjar had another interesting part to play in our exhibition, because the one that I showed you at the beginning of the lecture, which is now in the collection of the British Museum in London, actually was bought in Seoul by the man on the right here, who many of you will have heard of. This is, of course, Bernard Leach, who was arguably the most influential figure in British ceramics in the 20th century. You see him here with his colleague Shoji Hamada, the great Japanese potter, who's there on the left with the glasses. And Leach was a very interesting, really fascinating figure. He is often thought of as a traditionalist, maybe even backward looking in a way, but I have always thought that he was equally modern in his outlook. And a good example of that is seen in this famous design, the leaping salmon vase. He made several of these. This is a particularly high quality and early example, with this very distinctive brushed salmon figure, very elegant, capturing a real sense of the dynamic motion of this fish. And it takes its basic design language from historic Chinese ceramics, in this case, Suzhou ceramics, which is to say the iron slip decorated ceramics that became popular in the north of China in the Song dynasty. But as you can see, it also is a very different expression from those historic precedents, taller, different profile, and with this very direct painterly motif that has its roots in Leach's activity as a calligrapher and a printmaker and painter. So you can see that he's innovating at the same time that he's looking back. And this is also true of the other character who's important in the story of the Moonjar, who is Lucy Rhee, maybe the other most important figure in British 20th century ceramics, although not so much because she was influential. I think we can say that Leach had many, many followers, and Rhee essentially had none, because nobody could match her in the elegance of her work. She was a master at a higher level, I would argue, than Leach or any other potter that lived in her time. An incredible sense of elegance and refinement, which came to her really when she was young and growing up and working in Vienna in Austria. And she retained this sense of Central European modernism in her work throughout her career. But the reason that she's interesting to our story is because as you can see here in this image that was taken by the famous photographer Lord Snowdon, you can see that she actually had the moon jar that's now in the British Museum in her studio. And you can immediately see why she liked it, because she loved the color white. So here she is in her all white studio, dressed entirely in white, matches her beautiful silver hair. And she had the moon jar because Leach, having bought it in Seoul, as I said, lent it to her during the Second World War. And we have recently discovered letters between Leach and Rhee about this loan or gift, you might call it. Remarkably, Leach drove it through London when bombs were falling, and he was afraid that the jar would be hurt where he was living. So he gave it to Rhee, who lived in what he thought was a safer part of the city. But he also seems to have given it to her as a kind of tribute or a sentimental attachment between the two of them. His exact words were, keep the Korean jar with you in memory of the time we've had together. And it's interesting to speculate that at this point in the 1940s, they might almost have come close to having a romantic relationship, although because Leach was married, that seems not to have happened. But they clearly had a very strong sense of kinship and affection to one another. And so the jar, the moon jar, sat between them as a kind of symbol of this connection. And I think it's such a beautiful story because, of course, the object itself is made of two halves. And one can see Leach and Rhee in many ways as being like opposite representatives of the potential of craft in the 20th century. Leach, the traditionalist, and Rhee, the modernist. But as I've said, Leach was very innovative, and Rhee also learned a great deal from past design history. And so again, I think of this as a kind of coming together that is perfectly symbolized by the object itself. And what I would also like to say about this story is that this too is part of material intelligence. So it's not simply the knowledge of technique or the knowledge of history or a scientific understanding of why materials behave as they do. For example, why a clay vitrifies when it's fired to a high temperature, or why a glaze fits onto the clay or not, because it has the same rate of expansion and contraction when it's heated. So those are, of course, types of material intelligence. But I would also like to suggest that an emotional affinity to objects and that sense of connection with them can also be an extremely significant part of material intelligence. And moreover, that in a way is the point of the whole exercise. So in other words, it's not knowledge for its own sake, and it's also not knowledge that allows you to manipulate the world around you. In other words, applied knowledge. It's also knowledge of a deeper kind that gets you to why it matters and fundamental questions about what it is to be a human on the planet Earth. And in that way, it's connected to questions of social and political and cultural thought, and of course, very deeply connected to questions of sustainability and awareness of climate change, prevention of climate change. So this topic of material intelligence takes us from the technical through the artistic all the way to the philosophical. Just to say, there are many other beautiful ceramic artists working in Britain, and I couldn't resist showing you a couple of them before moving on in my talk, because they're such beautiful expressions of the idea of material intelligence in all of the ways that I've been talking about. So here, for example, are works by Magdalena Adundo, again, a name you probably know, a Kenyan-born British-based artist who draws very widely from the repertoire of historical ceramics, including African ceramics, but also Southwestern Native American ceramics and other sources in her work. And then this is a picture that I took actually in Jennifer Lee's studio. She again works in London and has a remarkable practice that involves building the ceramic vessels very, very patiently, slowly with coiling, and then pinching and smoothing the clay as she moves up. And then, as you can see here, particularly in this second pot from the right, with these strong diagonals that almost look like a deposit of clay or earth, cross section of the Earth's crust. The way that she accomplishes this is to build the whole vessel. And this part is amazing. Then she cuts into it, having already spent maybe 2 weeks constructing it, and then works a different color of clay into the wall and then re-smooths it. So an incredibly difficult, painstaking technique. She only is able to complete maybe 12 or 15 pieces a year using this technique. Like Magdalene Odundo also, who works at a very similar rate. So, we're talking about a month of somebody's life compressed into each of these objects. And it really gives you a sense of the commitment and dedication that is involved in material intelligence at its highest level. One last example would be Edmund Duvall, again, a familiar name to many of you. That same idea of marking time is present in many of his works. For example, this one, which is called A Place Made Fast, which almost seems like the marking of a calendar, almost like an entire year that's been hung on the wall of the experience of being in the studio, throwing at the wheel, then standing back, thinking about what he's made, and then putting it into the world in a very sensitive and thoughtful manner. So I'm not going to talk about ceramics for the whole time. In fact, I'm done with ceramics, but I wanted to use this particular discipline to give you a sense of how rich the possibilities for material intelligence are. And you can take this same way of thinking to any other material, as I'll explain a little bit at the end of my talk. I should mention a book that I wrote a few years ago, which was called Fewer Better Things, The Hidden Wisdom of Objects, which just came out from Bloomsbury, I think in 2018. And that was the book where I first explained the concept of material intelligence. As you can see, the cover has a rather wonderful painting that gives you a very good sense of the stillness and focus on objects that I've been trying to describe. It's by an artist called William Bailey. And in that book, I talk a lot about why we might think of material intelligence, again, not just as a technical matter, but also as a philosophical and ethical matter. And what I often did in the book was to contrast what I'm calling material intelligence with, oh, sorry, I forgot that I had this image here. This is just for what it's worth, this is an object that actually started my career. So I tell the story in the book that when I was a student at Harvard University, an undergraduate student, I had the great good luck to be in a class with a professor that was dedicated to the history of Chinese ceramics. And what we were able to do was to go into the storage room of the university museum and actually handle these objects. And they were passed around between us from hand to hand. And so I was able, for example, to handle this Tang Dynasty plate. It's in Chinese, it's referred to as a Sansai Palette, a Sansai meaning 3 colors. So we have the lead green, the iron brown and the cobalt blue here on a stoneware plate. And it was fascinating for me to learn about it, not only technically, the way that lead or iron and cobalt can make color, but also the relationship to metalwork, which was actually the source for this design. It's interesting to note that ceramics very often imitates metalwork, which is of course a more expensive medium. So ceramics sort of follows the influence of metalwork in most cases. But also in a more primary way, I fell in love with this object. You know, I could really almost feel the fingers of the potter who had made it. And after all, it's 1,000 years old. So it also had this incredible energy. And I often think that what I'm now calling material intelligence starts with that kind of an impulse. It's not necessarily an intellectual matter. It's not necessarily driven by intellectual curiosity. Sometimes it's a more purely physical and intuitive or instinctive thing. And I think we should also have a lot of respect for that. What I was going to say, though, is that this intuitive, rich, complex dimension of material intelligence is arguably slipping away from us now because we're spending more and more of our time on screens. And I don't mean on screens like what we're doing now, which is great because we're communicating from one person to another and sharing our ideas and, you know, speaking and listening. But what I'm talking about is the tendency that we have to get sucked into our screens and perpetually distracted by them. And when you think about it, objects like this one, an Apple iPhone, and I have one here too, to show you that I'm part of this story. Objects like these, of course, are very powerful and they do a lot of good for us in the world, but they also are designed to be as frictionless, without friction, without features as possible, to be smooth and simple so that we feel like we're gliding into them without any resistance. And I find this to be a problem because when you think about it, what materiality does for you is precisely to provide a kind of resistance. In other words, it pushes back in very specific ways on your attempts to shape it. And so we need to design tools that overcome that resistance. A really good example of that, which again I talk about in my book, Fewer Better Things, is the example of what in English we call a fret saw. So called because it's designed to make what's called fretwork, which is very very tight ornamental carving. I'll show you a little bit of that in a minute. And you know, it's very easy to take tools like this for granted, but think about how brilliant the design of this is. So it's got this big U shape, which means that you can work around the piece of wood that you're cutting. Whereas if it were, you know, if it just had a little bit of a shallow curve here, you would only be able to cut, say, an inch away from the edge of the piece that you're working on. But here you can cut, you know, up to 6 inches in from the edge. Also notice that the blade is removable, which means, first of all, of course, you can replace the blade if it gets broken or dull. But also, just as importantly, you can actually start a cut from the middle of a workpiece by drilling a hole, detaching one end of the blade, feeding it through the hole, reattaching it to the frame of the saw, and then you begin cutting. It's brilliant. And, you know, it's the kind of thing that is easy to, as I say, take for granted once somebody else has thought of it. But think about, you know, how difficult it was to come up with that set of ideas. And of course, only a very skilled woodworker would have had the reason to invent something like this. Woodworkers who were making objects like this, which is a good example of 17th century marquetry, marquetry means almost like a jigsaw puzzle made of woods and other materials. In this case, you're looking at brass here and tortoise shell that have been cut and then laid together like a jigsaw puzzle, as I said. One very cool thing about this technique is that you usually get two panels from doing one set of cutting, because you'll have this one with a tortoiseshell background and the brass inlay, but there would be another version that has a brass background and a tortoiseshell inlay because you're cutting them together at the same time. So again, a very, very interesting and technically complex, challenging craft, but one that would be not possible without the innovation of the tool itself, as well as the ornament and the knowledge of the material, like the tortoise shell and the brass. So, think about how much goes into making an object like this, not just, of course, the cutting and the casting, for example, to make this head with the ribbons, but also the processing of the materials before they even get to the workshop. The tortoise shell needs to come from somewhere. The brass needs to come from somewhere. So when we look at an object like this, yes, we should be thinking about the French court, and we should be thinking about the idea of Baroque design, but we should also be thinking about tortoises and how they were farmed and how their shells were treated and traded. We should be thinking about mining and the nature of metallic alloys like brass, which are combined from copper and other metals. So these stories go very, very deep. And, you could say that even one object like this has enough stories to keep you curious forever. It's not a matter of getting to the bottom of an explanation. It's rather a matter of being curious and having the habit of mind to ask questions about these objects and how they got to be the way they are. So I'm going to finish my talk now just with a little description of a brand new project that I have underway, which is actually called Material Intelligence. As you can see here is a new online publication from the Chipstone Foundation, which is here in the United States. And what we're doing is devoting each of these digital magazine issues to one material. So, for example, the first one is oak, and we are looking at it from a whole range of different perspectives, thinking about what people have said about oak and the place that oak trees have in poetry and literature. I particularly like this line by George Bernard Shaw. He said, "Think of the fierce energy concentrated in an acorn. You bury it in the ground and it explodes into an oak. Bury a sheep and nothing happens but decay." It's a wonderful idea, sort of conveying the miraculous, magical nature of this object, which has a whole 100-foot tall oak tree contained within it. And so we take the reader around the world to look at oak trees, for example, these which are in Spain and are used to make barrels for the sherry industry. And these barrels are also reused for the whiskey industry in Scotland. And so we had an expert on whiskey making write about oak for us. Maybe not what you would expect, but if you know anything about whiskey, you'll know that these sherry oak casks are absolutely crucial to the taste of the drink. And so this is a really good example of a whole area of material intelligence that has all to do with oak, that's not to do with woodworking. A story that is very much about woodworking is that of these boats which are being made and repaired and used in Iceland. Originally, they were used as fishing boats, and now they're actually being repurposed for tourism, for whale watching and so on. But we had an essay written by somebody who's very close with the communities of boat builders who are restoring these 50-year-old or 40-year-old vessels for this new purpose. We have an article about a woman called Octavia Butler, who is one of America's most well-known science fiction writers. And this essay by Shanika McIntosh talks about her use of oak and acorns as symbols in her novels, particularly her best-known novel, Parable of the Sower. So as I mentioned, we're thinking here about material intelligence, not only in a direct, literal, physical sense, but also in an interpretive, philosophical sense. And Octavia Butler is a very good example of that. We have beautiful illustrations done by our graphic designer, Wynn Patterson. This is now bringing us into the linen issue. So here we see a set of sheafs of flax, which is the plant from which linen is made. You see an image of that on the left, and on the right, a beautiful, I love this photograph, a beautiful 100-year-old photograph of freshly starched linen collars. And this was back at the time that people had removable collars, so they didn't have to wash their whole shirt, only the collars, which of course were quickest to get stained, because laundry used to be much more difficult than it is today. So the role that linen has in cleanliness and hygiene in culture is something that we looked at for this issue. We also have issues coming up on rubber and copper. And next year we'll be looking at terracotta, we'll be looking probably at acrylic, and also at obsidian, the black stone obsidian. So this is the website for the magazine. It is already live. There are only 2 issues so far, oak and linen, but you can go to this website and read it and see the images. Of course, it's only in English for now, I'm afraid, but it will give you a sense of the project, I hope, and I hope that you may be interested to have a look at it. Of course, we're very interested in having contributions from all around the world, very much including Korea. So if anybody is interested to write for us, please let me know. And I think I will leave it there and now welcome comments from all of you and from my commentator. So thank you very much for listening. And I'd also like to thank the translator for keeping up with me. Thank you.
Mr. Adamson, thank you for the very interesting presentation. The concept of material intelligence, when I first heard about it, I thought, what does that mean? So I was curious about it. I was intrigued by the concept. So this material creates objects, and when objects are being used, they create value, and this value gets translated into some other types of values. So overall, it provides a clue, comprehensive clue to the physical world that we are living in. That is my understanding about the material intelligence. And you said that understanding and connecting and using material is one part of material intelligence. And I think that was indeed a very apt explanation of material intelligence. And you also mentioned that emotional affinity creates meaning to the material that we are using and the object that we are using. And I think this is a core message that expands our understanding about the world that we are living in. And during your presentation, you cited the moon jar from the Joseon Dynasty. From the shape of the moon jar, you mentioned that 2 figures, Bernard Leach and Louis Lee, met with each other, and you took symbol from the moon jar. And the story of oak was very interesting as well. So I appreciate that. I wish we had more panelists here. I wish we had more time here because that topic was so fascinating. But despite that, since our time is running out, I just would like to invite President Kim Jae-hee, who has been here with us and listened to your presentation. So we would like to invite her for the one-on-one discussion so that we can find more clues for deeper talks. With that, President Kim, please. Good morning and good afternoon. Thank you for the interesting talk. What you have said means a lot to the digitalized or immaterialized world that we are living in. I think we are restoring our passion or affinity toward materials so that we can better connect with other people and create concrete solidarity with people around us. So listening to what you said, the material intelligence is our ability or to appreciate the material, and it is our attention. I think we can start developing material intelligence by developing attention, paying attention to the things surrounding us. But if people just casually think about material intelligence, I think there is chance that people just blindly assume that material intelligence is only for craft. And I think, of course, in your article and in your presentation, you have mentioned examples of writing, and you also mentioned that you will not let a doctor without material intelligence handle your surgery in your article. And with that, I could see that you do not confine the concept of material intelligence to craft. But some people might blindly assume that. And I wanted to know if you can provide us with a example specifically more related to craft, since we are in the craft biennale. I would like to ask you to share some more examples. That would be my first question, and I will come back to my second one after your answer.
Okay, thank you very much. That is a great question. I think it might be worth saying first that I was very concerned not to limit material intelligence only to craft. And I think if you come from the craft world, you might assume that material intelligence means craft. But I think the same might be true for an engineer. So if an engineer hears material intelligence, they might think that's engineering. Or, a material scientist who understands the molecular structure of materials, they might think that is what they do. And so one thing that I was trying to do in exploring this concept was to show that all of these fields are connected, and that actually this can be a pathway between craft and other disciplines that it's usually set in opposition to. And instead of having this kind of conflict, I wanted to have a sense of continuity. So that feels important to say. Maybe I would use as another example of craft, with that in mind, the example of prototyping. So in other words, making by hand a model for something that will then be mass produced, which is maybe an unusual example, not what you would expect. We all think of ceramics or woodwork as craft. Maybe we don't think of, our phones as craft objects, but they were once crafted. And I think, the difficulty is that we literally lose touch with that original crafting, the carving of the shape in foam or other materials that's being done in Apple by only a few people. And then you have millions and millions of people that have that shape in their pocket, but they have no sense of the craft that created it. And that's the kind of distance or alienation that I think is the difficulty.
Listening to your answer, I actually recently read a book, Staying with the Trouble. That is the book I recently read. And they said that we have to make kinship, not children. And listening to what you said, for example, if we are talking about clay, we cannot just create pottery which is children from clay, but we can create kinship from clay and makes all sort of other things. I wonder if my understanding is correct. All right. The material intelligence is not confined to craft, and you said that it can be the pathway toward other disciplines. And this broad concept came to me listening to the comment provided by President Kim and listening to Mr. Adamson's talk. So material intelligence is not confined to craftsmanship. It is linked to all the other disciplines that exist in the world, and it is actually the pathway that links diverse disciplines. And I think this is really persuasive and convincing. With that, I would like to move on to the next question. The next question might sound grandiose. The title of the second question would be this: would the material intelligence be able to save us? That would be the title of my my question. You said that the material intelligence can help us build solidarity and connection to the society that we are living in. And also in your article at the end of it, you mentioned that this might sound utopian, but we will cast our hope for the material intelligence. For me, I have been studying the concept of touch based on the ideas of Rhee Irigaray. And for me, this sense of touch or tactile sensation disseminates all the visual art and creates mutually interdependent relations. So it is something beyond that mere sense. It can change our attitude toward the world, and I think that is the sense of touching. So I think maybe the way you approached the material intelligence is similar with the way I approached to the tactile sense. But then recently, if you look at the social media, you can see a lot of images that emphasizes the sense of touch or a sense of material, and there are so many craft arts. And I think our emphasis to the sense of touch and our emphasis to the material is not saving us. It is rather driving us go back to focus on what we see or what we touch too much, or drive us to the commercialization, which makes me feel a little bit frustrated. So you said that we have to pay attention to material for connection, solidarity, and communication in this unmaterial world. But these days, all these ideas, without concrete objects, all these information come in visual information and just spread all over the internet without the real object that we can touch or feel. So this creates concerns. So with that, how we can resist this? That would be my question.
Yeah, that's such a great question. Well, you mentioned Luce Irigaray, the feminist theorist, and I think that her emphasis on touch would not be satisfied with the image of touch. So I would want to make a very strong distinction between touch or tactility as a kind of brand to sell things, and touch as a way of actually being grounded in real life and in the life of other people, which is what Irigaray is talking about. You know, it's been a long time since I read her, but my recollection is that in fact, she's precisely arguing against the prioritization of vision over touch, right? So there's this sinister thing that happens when vision claims tactility as one of its subject matters. And I completely agree with you that what happens there is that material intelligence is sort of pounded flat and made into a superficial symbol of itself, but without any substance behind it. And that's why I think it's important to distinguish between let's say, just tactility and the pleasure of tactility, and what I'm calling material intelligence. Because for me, the intelligence part has to do with that depth of connection. It's not just a quick, transient, in other words, ephemeral or passing relationship. It is over time. It has to do with expertise and commitment. And that's absolutely crucial. To go back to the first part of your very interesting question, you asked about material intelligence saving us. And actually, it's funny that you say that, because the last chapter of my most recent book is called Can Craft Save America? So it's a story about American history, and I wanted to think about that. But if you think about it on a global level, there's, of course, the very pressing question of climate change and sustainability. And I feel like, as I mentioned briefly in my talk, I feel like material intelligence can both be a social connector, and it can also be a mechanism to encourage people to have a stronger sense of responsibility for the environment. Because if you understand the environment better, then I think you're almost by definition more likely to take care of it. The way that if you understand your child, you'll understand how to take care of her or him better. And I feel like that's the relationship that we need to have, a relationship of caring, which is based in knowledge and deep understanding.
Thank you. That was such an interesting discourse. And listening to your conversation, I had a hard time resisting my temptation to interrupt and ask questions. And the case you made for material intelligence, would it change the order of the human society and basically save us? That was the core message of Ms. Kim's question. And listening to Mr. Adamson's answer to that question, I came to think about this, about material intelligence. I think this can be a concept that reflects our responsibility and the ethical morality of human beings as we live on this planet Earth. All the pieces that create our life also creates the environment that we are living in. And deep inside of the environment that we are living in, we see a small object that we have to pay attention to, the small objects that we have been neglecting, but actually that are filling up the environment, the physical environment that surrounds us. Our attitude toward all these tiny objects and the tiny material surrounding it would come back and help us and ultimately save us. That is what I could think listening to the conversation. And about the concept of material intelligence, you said that you are doing a project and publishing journals. And I think I come to develop more interest in the project going on. You mentioned that oak, the case of oak. This oak can lead to the cask, and you also cited the examples of the oak vessels and the oak boat. And listening to the stories, I think these materials is a key when it comes to all the circulation taking place in the world. And I think your magazine project will be a great venue for us to explore this concept of circulation in the world. So I very much look forward to your projects and all the issues that will come. Thank you both. It was such a meaningful discussion. I wish we had more time so that we can discuss more. I believe this conversation helped our watchers feel more relatable to the concept of the material intelligence. So I would like to thank once again Mr. Adamson and President Kim once again. And with that, we would like to wrap up the second session of the International Colloquium on Craft Value Sharing. Thank you for watching.